it sounds like as you're describing it, there may be some particular things that need to happen within church environments in order to promote this. But part of what you're saying is we need to really promote what it is to be healthy persons as the first step into the kind of community that allows us to engage this issue as well.
It's very difficult to predict what kinds of things are going to be the things that make the next step possible, doing recovery ministry in the local church. But one of my most fundamental convictions is that it's possible to start from almost anywhere. I'll give you my best story about this. Okay. This is a story. Years ago, I did a series of workshops on how to do recovery ministry in the local church. One-day workshops, very basic and simple, that we did in 4 or 5 parts of the country. And the last exercise of the day was always next steps, and this was all for pastors. And I'd say, what's one thing that you could go home and do, actually do, that you could imagine. And the only thing I really remember about these workshops is this one pastor who just couldn't think of anything. And he said things like, I'm in a church where if you move the communion table 3 feet to the left, you can get fired. So it was a pretty locked down kind of place.
I've been to that church.
Yeah, you've been to that church. So it was not a church that was excited about innovation. And so I talked with him and I said, well, is there something that you do on Sunday morning that no one notices? What's the smallest part of your worship service? Mm-hmm. He said, wow, there's the greeting. No one pays the slightest attention to the greeting that I do at the beginning of the service. Everybody's out in the foyer. They don't come in until the organ starts. And the organ doesn't start until they get to the end of the greeting and say, let's sing hymn number 263. So I said, okay, let's just do an experiment. Just one time, don't change your music, don't change your sermon. Just one time, go home and change your greeting based on what you learned at this workshop. So what would you do to change your workshop, your introduction, your welcome, to reflect what you learned here today? He said, well, I'd probably try to tell the truth. I said, I felt very good about that. He got the main point of the day. So he goes home, and next Sunday he stands up and says, I was at a workshop this weekend. I learned that people who had experienced abuse of different kinds as kids often find it hard to trust people at church when they grow older. Mm. If that's part of your story, I really want to thank you for coming. Let's sing hymn number 253.
Oh, that's invasive.
Yeah.
In a nice way.
Yeah. So he called me the next Tuesday after this. And he said, you've ruined my ministry. He was desperate and anxious, and because he was getting phone call after phone call from people who he knew were not paying any attention. And so he calls me up, and he says, I don't know what to do. He wasn't a counseling pastor kind of guy. He was an administrative pastor, really wanted a job at the denominational level kind of guy, So it was not. So I said, are you sure you don't know what to do? He said, yeah, I haven't the slightest idea what to do. I said, that's perfect. You don't know what to do. So the next time someone calls you, what do you think I'm going to advise you to say? He says, you're probably going to tell me to tell the truth. I said, that's exactly right. Next time someone calls you, tell the truth. And the truth is, I don't know what to say. I feel really bad about not knowing about this, but I don't really know anything about this. I don't know what to do. And I said, just add one thing. After you say that, ask the person who's calling you whether you can share their phone number with the next person that calls you. And that's what he did, which was a very courageous sort of thing, I think. Telling the truth for this guy was not, it's not easy for any of us, but for him it was a real leap, and it changed the culture of the church in the end. Because it didn't happen right away, but all of a sudden there were a lot of women in the congregation talking to each other. Nothing happened very quick, but the following spring at the women's retreat, all of a sudden there's a table of women who've been talking to each other for 6 months. And they're saying, I felt all alone with this. I thought I was the only one. And that isolation was really painful. And everybody said the same thing. And they started to say, it's not okay to feel like you're the only one. What can we do? A year later, he has a support group for survivors of childhood sexual abuse in the congregation. He's got therapists who volunteered to coach the leadership team for that group. He started a recovery ministry from changing the one thing he thought no one was paying any attention to. My conviction is if that guy can start a recovery ministry in his church, just about anybody can. So it's possible. Often you meet a lot of resistance. In any kind of institutions, you're going to meet resistance to start a recovery ministry because it's not business as usual. So there's going to be a lot of political work that has to be done. There's going to be a lot of paying attention to different stakeholders who are concerned about different things. And
can you talk a little bit more about that aspect of it? Because what you're describing is not something that's a 1 week and out sort of process. There's not a quick fix in managing this sort of process, is what you're saying.
Yeah. Now, a lot depends whether you're what kind of setting you want to start a recovery ministry in, or what kind of institution you're working in. If you're doing a church plant or starting a new institution, you have an opportunity there to kind of set a different sort of foundation from the very beginning, and there's special problems with that and advantages of that. In established churches, this is about really fighting for the hearts and minds of the congregation, with fighting for the identity of the congregation. Are we going to be the kind of people where it's okay to be in process, where it's okay to be broken, and where you can say that out loud? Or are we going to be a how are you fine, thank you church? And you can't expect that to happen overnight. You need to think this is part of your 5-year, 10-year strategic plan, this kind of stuff. Because you have to figure out realistically how much change is possible, how fast. You may not be able to bring everybody along on this process, so you may experience losses in the process. But you do your homework. Local churches and other Christian institutions are some of the most political institutions that exist. Amen. So my custom when I was working in a local church was to spend a good deal of time making sure that every stakeholder in a particular decision had been given the opportunity to express their reservations, been given an opportunity to talk to somebody in the congregation who was struggling with the kinds of issues we wanted to deal with. So that this meant pairing board members with individuals in the congregation who were struggling with whatever issue we were going to start a group about. But it meant that when it came time to vote on approval for that group, everybody knew that this was for us. This wasn't for those poor souls out there who needed this. We need this because we need this. And it's one of the things that I think is a bedrock important piece about Christian recovery ministry, is make sure you're doing this because we need this.
I think that point is really interesting. As I've watched this evolve in different churches, the movement it usually moves from we are in service to these people to where it becomes really healthy, it seems like, is when we need these people. These are not someone other than we are who we serve. These are people like us in reality, and their voice is needed for us in those times.
If there's at the root of things there's this premise that we're helping the other, then it's about them. It's not about me too. It's not about us. It's not about we're not all in this together, and that. I think can poison recovery ministries in a very fundamental way, because it leaves a root of spiritual pride. And one of the keys to recovery of any kind, in my view, is finding somehow the capacity for spiritual humility. And that's not an easy thing to come by. It's not encouraged necessarily in existing Christian traditions where it feels like it's really important to have all the right answers to all the right questions, and as long as you do, everything's fine. Of course, your life may be out of control, your kids' lives may be out of control, but at least you have all the right answers to all the right questions. Right. But I think it is a bitter pill. We want, in American culture, we like success, we like fast, we like fast break, we like stealing second base, we like anything fast. And to hear that this process might take time, might be complicated, might have relapses as part of it, is not really what we want to hear. But the Christian faith is not just about fast. No one I've never heard anybody in the Christian community complain about discipleship being for a lifetime. Everybody knows that discipleship's a lifetime word. It can take a long time. Nobody
Right.
says, are you still working on discipleship? No, you just kind of assume that discipleship is a lifetime thing, and recovery is like that. The recovery is a long-term word. It's a word, it's a process that really requires a faith in God's faithfulness over long periods of time, that God's not given up on us. Sometimes that faith is hard to come by, and you need a community of people around you that can help you see that with clarity. But if you have that sort of safe community around you, it makes all the difference in the world.
A lot of times, I don't know if you would say this is true, but I think a lot of that quick fix and happening fast sort of process really is part of the foundation for addiction. Even in some cases might be one of those things that has to be dismantled and made in some churches and some Christian institutions.
Yeah, that strikes me as a very thoughtful observation. I do think that one of the reasons people, not for everybody, but there's lots of people for whom the payoff for addiction is it takes care of the pain quickly. At least it does at the beginning, right? I mean,
manages it in some way.
It manages in some way. It feels like I'm okay. Now, the longer the addictive process as it works, the less it really. You start off feeling good, and then eventually you're struggling to feel normal, and then there's no way to get back to normal. You just feel bad.
Yes.
So, but initially the first use for some addictive substances is there's that kind of initial payoff. It's not true of all addictive substances. After all, first use of nicotine, the initial response is coughing and nausea for most people, but it's still pretty addictive stuff. So, yeah.
I think of Eugene Peterson's book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, and I can't imagine the development of these kind of ministries in a healthy way without that mentality. And it sounds that sounds like what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, there's a couple things to emphasize about that. One is, at the level of planning and thinking about what's possible to achieve in any kind of institution, there's a real importance in being able to see the God at work and slow things. If you're in recovery, particularly early recovery, you need to focus on 24 hours, right? Yes. You're not focused on long term. You're asking, how can I stay sober for 24 hours? And if you start thinking in bigger frames, you just get yourself in trouble. If you start thinking about the past too much, you're going to feel guilty and ashamed, and you've only got one strategy for dealing with guilt and shame, and that's to use. So get into the past too much early on, your likelihood of relapse goes up. If you think about the future, all you think about is just the fear goes through the roof. Absolutely. And you only got one strategy for dealing with fear. So again, your likelihood of relapse goes up. So AA is this relentless present tense focus about staying sober today. If you've never been addicted, one day doesn't seem like a big deal. If you've been addicted and you haven't been able to stay sober for 20 years, one day is this miracle from God. It's God breaking into history and doing the unthinkable. Yes. And, as no end of people could testify who have worked 12-step programs, you can make a life out of one day at a time. And don't want to, it's too much to ask, can you stop drinking forever? You just want to ask, can you, today, can you stop drinking? And what kind of support would you need to do that?
Those little practices fit very well for those of us who are Wesleyans. Those means of grace, those means by which we give God space to administer grace into our lives. And we think about prayer, Bible study, those classic disciplines. They are certainly there, but these are some of the things that Wesley said. These are means of grace as well.
Yeah. Well, if you look at what people actually do when they work the 12 steps, not the 12 steps, not 12 ideas or 12 principles. They're 12 suggested behaviors. So if you look at what people actually do, you'll find that it's really very much like some of the things that Wesley did, unlike in other ways, but certainly his penitential bans, the sort of questions you might hear from a sponsor are very like the kind of questions a penitential band leader might ask everybody who came to a group. And the sort of practices that are, the spiritual practices that are embedded in the 12-step program are all practices with long history in the Christian tradition. This is not stuff that was invented in a hot tub in California in the 1960s. This is, searching a fearless moral inventory. This is about, taking a look at oneself, then confessing what you come up with, and making amends to other people, and prayer and meditation. This is all stuff that's been around in the Christian tradition for a very long time. So here you have a very large movement of people doing all this distinctively Christian stuff, and they'll be criticized by two groups of people. In the secular context, the primary criticism of the 12-step movement is it's way too Christian. It's just thinly disguised Christian discipleship program. Look at all this stuff. It's all Christian stuff. Confession, what you do in group is testimonies, talks about God all the time. Whereas the principal criticism in the Christian context will be, this isn't Christian enough. I mean, there's no Christology in there, there's no eschatology in there, there's no, all the traditional Christian stuff isn't there. Now, my own instinct is that the secular criticism of the 12 steps is more thoughtful than the Christian criticism of the 12 steps. I don't think you make it any less Christian by focusing on suggested behaviors. The 12 steps are not intended to be a statement of faith. They're intended to be sort of baby steps in the right direction. Bill Wilson, one of the founders of AA, called it a spiritual kindergarten. It's just the first baby steps in the right direction. There'll be a lot to be revealed later as you learn more about the God who's actually helping you. But I think that if you're doing recovery stuff in a Christian context, you have to be sort of attentive to both those kinds of criticisms. And sometimes that's a difficult balancing act. But that's part of the skills we need to learn in doing Christian stuff.